The Old Hannibal House Break-In by J.P. O'Brien. Things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather victorious. Lorraine Herschey, sporting her finest grey business suit and lucky gold bracelet, punched a fist in the air and slammed the phone down so loudly that Mel and Tony from the adjacent offices ducked their heads around her door to find out what was going on. "Oh, nothing special," grinned Lorraine, reclining in her plush swivel chair. "Just my white whale." "The old Hannibal house?" asked Mel. "Lorraine, that is impressive," added Tony, offering a golf clap of approval. "Just a viewing for now," Lorraine clarified, holding her hand aloft to halt their premature celebrations. "But they're motivated. Lord knows what they see in that dump." Having tried and failed for the better part of a year now to offload this particular property, Lorraine was far more elated than her staunch professionalism allowed her to show. She couldn't stand that the miserable, crumbling wreck of a building situated at the corner of Sycamore Street and Arbor Park had so far bested her. Lorraine Herschey, Guildwood & Hart Real Estate's #1 rated agent 4 years running. The house had become something of a joke around the office for being frankly unsellable. And not just to be colourful. Several of the agents genuinely believed there existed a supernatural curse on the place that would prevent it from ever being inhabited again. Its previous owner, Bertrand Hannibal, had lived in the house for 50 years with his loving wife, Ethel Lynn, but upon her sudden passing had grown increasingly reclusive. Rumours began to spread. That old Hannibal had been responsible for the death, that old Hannibal had gone crazy because of the death, and perhaps most pervasive of all, especially among the younger, more impressionable residents in town, that the deceased Mrs. Hannibal's ghost still roamed the building. It didn't help matters that old Mr. Hannibal himself had quietly vanished one day, never to be seen again, without taking so much as his overcoat or walking stick. For years the house simply sat there, overgrowth from the front garden enveloping the stone pathway, the wooden beams of its porch succumbing to infestation and rot, and the walls' interiors filling with an ungodly stench from who knows what animal. The local council eventually branded the eyesore abandoned, and it became Guildwood & Hart's responsibility and, ultimately, Lorraine Hershey's problem. Thanks to her 8-year-old twin girls, Daisy and Ruby, and her equally gossipy colleagues, she knew all about the rumours, but considered herself impervious to such childish nonsense. But even she had to admit that the keys going missing the morning of her first walk-around with the potential buyers was more unsettling than inconvenient. Fortunately, the couple had been nice enough to wait for Lorraine to get a new set cut and reschedule to this morning. After sending Mel and Tony back to their offices, Lorraine started packing up her things. At that exact moment, her 2 daughters were sneaking up the house's rickety front steps towards its moss-covered front door. The girls had been engaged in a years-long game of dare, which, as far as either of them could remember, had begun 2 Christmases earlier when Daisy had challenged Ruby to lick an icy lamppost. After her tongue was finally unstuck, Ruby retaliated by daring Daisy to bite the head off a gingerbread man their nanny was removing from the oven. With one girl's tongue numb and the other's burned, the score was even at 1-1. Before they knew it, the game had devolved into an opportunistic series of climbing things, swiping things, hiding things, breaking things, and, on one occasion, posting things to Hawaii. The previous summer, Daisy had dared Ruby to snatch a box of live crickets from the counter of the Reptile Amphibian Emporium, while their classmate Charlie Burns fired an endless string of questions at the proprietor, Mr. Salazar. Shortly afterwards, Daisy had been challenged to empty it through a nearby window. They ran away giggling at the sound of Ben Radcliffe's girlish screams emanating from within. As for what happened when a task went uncompleted, that much was unclear. Such a situation had never arisen. The girls had both inherited their mother's determination and steadfast refusal to ever lose a game. The scar still faintly visible on Daisy's face from stealing one of Lars Gunderson's Pomeranians and Ruby's inability to fully straighten her right pinky finger after breaking her fall from an upstairs window were both testament to this. So today, with the score sitting at a remarkable 846 to 845, it was Ruby's turn to issue a test. She had dared Daisy to break into the old Hannibal house. Daisy's little hand jiggled the rusty doorknob to find it locked. As it happened, the key they needed was actually right under their feet, so to speak, buried in their own front garden by Daisy herself some weeks earlier. Remembering this handy detail would have made their break-in attempt all the easier. Instead, Ruby appeared beside her sister, offering a rock the size of a football. There was a loud crack as Daisy threw the rock, splintering the fraying wood around the lock, then watched the defeated door groan slowly open. They looked at each other. Ruby gestured to her sister to step through first. The inside of the house felt a full 10 degrees cooler than the pleasant mid-morning air in the garden, and as they tiptoed into the entrance hallway, their noses were suddenly assaulted with a horrendous stench like gym socks soaking in a bucket of rotten eggs. "Ugh," Daisy retched, pinching her nostrils as tightly closed as she could. Ruby pulled off her bobble hat to bury her entire face in it. The place was just like they had imagined. Dangling cobwebs everywhere, murky floorboards moaning beneath their weight, patches of mould spreading out from the corners of the ceiling all the way to the chandelier hanging above them. Straight ahead was a grandfather clock whose hands were motionless, and along the entire adjacent wall stood a hefty credenza, caked in dust, supporting an overtly ornate brass mirror that meekly reflected the room back at them. Ruby edged closer to the credenza. In front of the mirror there was a line of porcelain figurines, dancers and gymnasts in a variety of delicate poses, their paint fading under the dust. A daddy longlegs scuttled out from behind a pirouetting ballet dancer and quickly sought shelter in the gap behind the dresser. As she watched it, Ruby felt something furry graze the back of her neck. She pushed away with a sharp jolt, accidentally knocking into the credenza and causing the enormous brass frame on top of it to teeter forward for a moment before ultimately settling upright again. "Look what I found!" Daisy exclaimed, still pinching her nose from the smell. She was wearing a long black fur coat that she had taken from the fancy hat stand beside the door. She had stroked one of its sleeves against her unwitting sister. "Don't do that!" "Why not? Scared?" "No," snapped Ruby, rubbing away the tickling that lingered on her neck. "Anyway, I did it," said Daisy, looking around. "Now I dare you to run up there and slide down the banister." Ruby looked up. On either side of the grand staircase curved a wooden handrail that ascended to the landing. She considered it for a second, then turned back to Daisy. "Easy peasy." Moments later, the sound of her voice echoed throughout the hallway from above. "Ready?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she hoisted one of her legs over the railing and pushed herself away from the upper banister. Gravity quickly took hold, and though she tried to clasp the railing, she could do nothing to slow down. The wood rubbed harshly against her front side, and she squealed all the way to the bottom, at which point her rear end collided with the great wooden sphere adorning the lowermost banister pole, broke it clean off, and sent it flying through the air. Ruby herself, her chest and both hands stinging from the friction, slid off the end of the handrail and crumpled into a heap on the hardwood floor. Daisy watched in slow motion as the wooden sphere sailed in an arc through the air and hit the antique mirror with a deafening crash before landing on several of the porcelain figurines below it with a thud, then rolling off the edge of the credenza. Tinkling shards of glass and crystal followed it to the floor. Ruby dizzily climbed to her feet to see her panicked sister already bolting towards the front door. She started after her. But through the thick glass, Daisy caught the distorted figure of someone climbing the porch steps and approaching the house. Ruby ran straight into her sister's back. "What is it?" she asked, shaking her throbbing hands. "Go back," her sister hissed. Without knowing quite why she was running, Ruby crunched her way back over the shards of smashed mirror lying all across the floor. She froze at the sound of her mother's voice. "Girls!" In the unbearable silence that followed, Lorraine looked first into Daisy's eyes, then into Ruby's, then at the unthinkable damage all around them. "The house!" Violet Castellanos, in that moment strolling with Dapper past the creepy abandoned place on the corner, looked up to see a furious Lorraine marching Ruby and Daisy out of the door, down the porch steps, and through the overgrown weeds to the front gate. She was nearly run down as the procession passed her. "Is everything all—" "Please excuse us," interrupted Lorraine, not bothering to make eye contact. In no time at all, the girls were back in their room. Their mother had been tempted to lock the door behind her when she left, but thought better of it. And Lorraine was racing back to the old Hannibal house with a dustpan and brush to attempt whatever cosmetic repairs she could before the potential buyers showed up. She scrambled around on her knees for about 30 seconds before they appeared in the open doorway behind her. In his home just next door to the old Hannibal house, Joe Caldwell was oblivious to the chaos unfolding. But the silence in his living room was no better. He picked up an issue of Disc magazine and sat in his recliner, then managed about 2 lines of an interview with the legendary Don Carlos before deciding what he really wanted was a coffee. While waiting for the kettle to boil, he wandered over to the bookshelf in his hallway and blew away some dust that had come to rest on the top of the books, then did the same to the shelf below, and then the shelf above. He caught sight of a photo of himself with Tom and Catherine Evans at a festival they had attended 3 summers before. Catherine's messy pigtails partially obscured the face paint across her cheeks, while Tom was pretending to bite Joe's ear. All of them were beaming with delight. Joe picked up the photo and sighed. Before Catherine had become pregnant with baby James, she and Tom had spent countless evenings with Joe out on his deck, exchanging anecdotes and jokes, discussing music and books, or just sharing beers and watching the clouds drift overhead. They hadn't been by in weeks. As he considered how much they probably had their hands full, Joe thought of his own son, Rory. 18 years prior, Joe had taken the decision to leave behind his rock star career in order to raise him. Now that son was spending all his time with either his girlfriend, Leona, or his friends, Alex, Enrico, and Peter, in the garage Joe had converted into a rehearsal space. Forgetting about the coffee he was halfway through making, he drifted up to Rory's room. Above his son's desk was a wall covered with photos of his friends, and shelves filled with CDs, books, and magazines. Affixed to his computer monitor was a Polaroid of Rory with Leona, with a heart-shaped paint streak encircling their 2 grinning faces. Among the other CDs was a yellow jewel case Joe hadn't seen in years. He picked it up. It was a burned CD that the 2 of them had made together when Rory must have still been a toddler. The track list, complete with backwards E's and S's, was full of the songs Joe considered integral to his son's musical education, including I'll Follow the Sun, one of the earliest songs he had ever taught him to play on the guitar. The nostalgia burning his chest, Joe put the CD back in its place and left. The sight of Lorraine and her girls marching out of the abandoned house on the corner had given Violet Castellanos a similar moment of parental reflection. She, too, had been the mother to a rather rambunctious daughter and recognized the look on Lorraine's face, impatience and frustration with just a pinch of helplessness. She decided to visit Marigold Weatherby in search of advice. The eccentric former opera singer invited Violet in without even asking what she was there for, which Violet took as a sign of her elderly neighbour's altruistic nature. It turned out, however, that Marigold simply needed someone able-bodied and dexterous to fish out a teaspoon that had tumbled behind one of her kitchen drawers. As the younger of the 2 women reached her hand awkwardly over the back of the drawer, she had a moment to ask about Lorraine. "Oh, that one's always been a lion," explained Marigold with a touch of judgment in her voice. "She won't back down for anything. Were you here when she tried to get poor Lars's Pomeranians put down?" "Yes, I think that was just after we moved in." "Stay on her right side, whatever you do," Marigold advised. "Tea?" Violet said she'd love one and kept on fishing behind the drawer. By now her arm was starting to ache, but then she had the idea to use a nearby pair of chopsticks to get a little extra reach. Maria Callas, sitting on Marigold's shoulder as she filled the kettle, eyed the intruder and the chopsticks with some suspicion. "That was when her girls tried to steal them, wasn't it?" Violet clarified. "What do you think of them, by the way? The two twins?" "Daisy and Ruby. Oh, those nuisances. They could have been such sweet little things." "Get into trouble a lot, do they?" Violet smiled. Then, biting her tongue, she made a final push into the depths of the kitchen unit. "Ah, got it!" Marigold suddenly lowered her voice and leaned closer to her guest, wholly uninterested in the spoon Violet was now holding. "Between you and me, I wonder if she perhaps underestimated it." Violet looked conspiratorially from side to side and similarly lowered her voice. "Who?" "The mother, dear," Marigold burst out, starting to grow somewhat annoyed that her new gossip partner wasn't just a little sharper. "I think she saw motherhood as just some other mountain she had yet to conquer. That's why she was so much older when she had them." Maria Callas let out a little whistle, prompting Marigold to stroke the bird's feathers with a delicate finger. "What happened to the father?" Marigold's eyes sparkled. "No father, dear. No, no. Those girls are the result of modern science. Quite remarkable. Just think, before too long we'll have no use for men anymore." With no warning at all, Violet thought about a specific moment from her own lifetime, roughly 17 years earlier, when she had been standing outside the front door of her parents' home, breathing heavily. She was 20 years old and had just been informed by the lovely nurse at the sexual health clinic that she was pregnant. The next few moments after going through that door were a scrambled blur of adrenaline and emotion, but she could remember yelling at her father. She was perfectly capable of raising a child on her own, whether he wanted to believe it or not. Violet blinked to find that Marigold was still talking. "Could afford the best fertility specialists, you see. Ended up with twins, no less." Marigold appeared not to have noticed her guest's mind wandering. The younger woman nodded, then took the teaspoon over to the sink. "Well, good for her, I say." Back in her own home, Violet stood outside Leona's bedroom door. Even though she knew her daughter was still at school, she knocked out of habit before quietly letting herself in. She inspected the walls and looked at the paintings thumbtacked to the cork. They must have been Leona's work because they all had the same squiggly signature in the bottom right corner. There were shimmering sections of bright colour, but also jagged lines and shadows. They conveyed what the world must look like to a teenager, Violet considered. Chaotic, but exciting. Her daughter was a wonderfully gifted artist. She glanced at Dapper's cushion in the corner. Leona had always been fantastic with animals. Then she spotted the cuddly bear sitting beside the pillow on the bed, which Leona had brought home from one of her and Rory's first proper dates. He was sweet, Violet thought, although maybe not quite as rough around the edges as some of her previous boyfriends. Perhaps that was a good thing. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran a finger over the teddy bear's head. On the bedside table sat an old copy of The Little Prince. Violet picked it up and began leafing through the pages. The two of them must have read through it together dozens, if not over 100 times. It had always been Violet's solution when things between them were terse. They were considerably better now, of course. Stability. That was the key. It was just a shame it had taken Violet most of Leona's childhood to realise it. She took the book and closed the bedroom door on her way out. Violet shuffled up the Hershey's front path, looking at the garden around her with a raised eyebrow. There were numerous odd mounds of dirt and various abandoned trinkets littering the soil. She was relieved that she had only ever had the one daughter to contend with. When Lorraine opened the door to her, she seemed confused by the intrusion, but kept an eye glued to the mobile phone in her left hand. "Yes?" Lorraine offered, a little spikily, eventually raising her gaze to meet Violet's. Violet tried to smile in a friendly way, but ended up just baring her teeth. "Hi, I'm Violet Castellanos. I live just over there. We haven't formally met yet. I wanted to drop by." Lorraine shook the hand that was offered to her, concealing her annoyance with the interruption underneath a well-honed sheen of professionalism. "Pleasure. What can I do for you?" "Well," Violet stuttered. Perhaps this woman really was as severe as her neighbours had led her to believe. "I actually wanted to lend you something." A book my daughter and I used to enjoy when she was younger. I believe I'm right in thinking your girls are about that age now." Violet held up the worn copy of The Little Prince, but couldn't help but notice Lorraine bristle. "My girls?" the lady in the slightly dusty suit asked, pulling her attention away from her phone for a moment. A very finely plucked eyebrow lifted, effortlessly conveying the sentiment, "What business is it of yours?" Again, Violet felt the need to fight fire with kindness. "Yes, I know it can be hard if you're a single parent and working a lot. I remember once I was in the kitchen and my Leona—" "Violet, was it?" Lorraine cut in. "Listen, I don't mean to be rude, but I can assure you I'm more than capable of handling my daughters whichever way I see fit." "Yes, of course. I didn't mean—" "And as for how much or how little I work, that, I'm afraid, is none of your concern." Violet stood in the doorway. The slim paperback in her hand suddenly felt like a 10-ton weight. "I appreciate your walking over here," Lorraine concluded. "But please leave the parenting to me, and I'll let you know if I need anything else. Goodbye." With that, Lorraine closed the door in Violet's face. Shell-shocked, Violet wandered back up the Hershey's front path and let herself out of the gate, the copy of The Little Prince still weighing heavy in her hands. She was so rattled she didn't even notice Miss Tiny coming towards her on her way over to Lars Gunderson's house for an evening meal. The diminutive librarian had to jump out of the way of Violet to avoid being pushed to the pavement. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you." "Don't worry," blushed Miss Tiny. "Happens all the time." "You work at the school, don't you?" "That's right. Sophie, pleasure to meet you." She held out a hand for Violet to shake. "Violet, I'm Leona Castellanos' mum." Miss Tiny was too tactful to admit she wasn't familiar with that particular student. Leona was certainly more of a mainstay in the art block than in the library. But the book in Violet's hands caught her attention, and she automatically snapped into librarian mode. "The Little Prince! An excellent choice!" Violet found her new acquaintance's enthusiasm infectious. She looked down at the book's cover and smiled. "Isn't it? I used to read this with my daughter when she was younger, a few years ago now. But I was hoping someone else might be able to get some use— well, anyway." She glanced off to the side. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly," Miss Tiny quoted. "Your daughter must have learnt to see rightly if this is what you were reading her." Violet didn't realise she was once again thinking of the paintings on her daughter's walls until she noticed Miss Tiny tilting her head expectantly. "Thank you," she said at last. "I believe she has done just that." Joe Caldwell had managed to pry a yawning Tom away from his fatherly duties for long enough to share a beer in his recreation room. Joe's, so announced the cursive fluorescent sign above the bar. Bleeding through the wall came the occasional crackle of a guitar amp or the smash of a cymbal as his son's band, having just arrived after school, fired up their instruments in the garage. After a moment, they launched into a rough groove while the two dads sat and listened. "Pretty good. Rory can really play," assessed Tom, pointing a finger away from his bottle's neck. He suddenly brightened into a talk show host persona. "Joe Caldwell, how's it feel to raise a rock star?" Joe winked, the lines deepening between his eyes and greying temples. "Feels good. Let's watch how far he goes." Tom leaned forward to clink beers, then sat back on his bar stool. They fell into a reflective silence until Tom broke it with a question so unexpectedly sincere it took Joe a moment to catch up. "And are you looking after yourself all right?" "What?" "Well, we're well aware we're not coming around as much anymore. We don't like it either. We miss hanging out." "Oh, no, that's okay. You've got a family now. Of course things are going to be different. Doesn't bother me in the slightest. You should be really excited." Joe picked at his bottle's label with a fingernail. "We are. We couldn't be happier. We just don't want you to feel abandoned or anything." "I appreciate that. Don't worry, I'm all right. Not too bored." Joe looked around his rec room. Besides the bar and the illuminated sign, he had a pinball machine, a jukebox, and a wall full of memorabilia from his touring days. He hadn't had to worry about money since the Mountaintop Synthesis's breakout success in, among other places, Brazil. He had been the singer, guitarist, and driving force in the band, but had decided to dissolve it at the height of their fame in order to come home. He bought the house on Sycamore Street where he and his son had lived ever since. The song rumbling in from next door fell apart, and a muffled discussion, led by Rory, began. Tom put his bottle on the bar and stood up in preparation to clap exuberantly before stopping himself. "They probably don't want an audience yet, do they?" Joe smiled. "I don't even think they know we're here. That's a secret 4 p.m. beer you've got there." "Not secret from Catherine, I guarantee. As soon as I said I was coming over, she knew we were drinking." The boys in the garage began their second attempt at the song. It sounded a little more cohesive than before. Joe and Tom listened for a minute before Tom spoke. It was now his turn to wink. "What if you tried dating again?" "I should put you in touch with my dad," commented Joe. "You two would have lots to talk about." "You're eligible! Look at that handsome salt and pepper beard!" Joe jutted out his stubbly chin and rubbed it with his hand. "Dashing, would you say?" "Who wouldn't want that?" Tom concluded out loud with a sparkling smile. They finished their beers and enjoyed their private performance of that one song repeatedly before Tom stood up. "All right, I got to get out of here. I've got the late shift." "Good luck." Joe stopped himself from asking when they would next see each other. "Give Catherine my love." Joe saw him out, then opened the door leading through to the garage. The boys had started on another of Rory's original compositions, with a driving bass and melancholic chords from Alex and Enrico, while Peter chugged away behind the drums. Rory, with eyes closed, riffed over the top on his guitar, his fingers drifting effortlessly around the high strings. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed his father standing in the doorway. The sight made Rory lose his place, and he rested his wrists over the fretboard. One by one, as the others noticed, they similarly stopped playing. "Hi, Dad," Rory said when the silence returned. "Sorry, too loud?" No, not at all. It's sounding good. Although, can I share some pointers?" He looked over at Peter, sitting on the drum stool with one hand resting on his cymbal, then took a step down onto the garage floor. The concrete was partially covered with a dusty rug to absorb the sound. Rory recoiled slightly. Yeah? It's a little bit muddy. If you bring down the mids on Enrico's guitar, your riff will be much clearer. Better balance. Do you mind?" He moved towards his son's friend's amp without waiting for an answer. There. Just tweak the EQ a little bit. See if that sounds any better. And what are you going to do about a singer? Nothing like an all-time great frontman." Joe winked. "Or woman." Rory rubbed the back of his neck. The other three looked between Rory and his dad, waiting to see what happened. "We kinda like just doing instrumentals for now. We like it this way. I used to put adverts in the local paper. I don't know if you lot still do it that way, but—" "Thanks, Dad," interrupted Rory. "Sorry, I think we're fine." Joe stopped in his tracks, suddenly reading that every other person in the room wanted him gone. His cheeks burned. "Absolutely, you're right, I'm gone, sorry." "Thanks," Rory repeated. He didn't say another word, just stared through his dad at the door behind him. Out on the street, Joe buried his hands in the pockets of his denim jacket as the daylight was gradually starting to fade. He stopped at his front gate and looked at the sky, then took a few big gulps of air. A few chords rang out through the closed garage door behind him, and for a moment they sounded like the opening of another song he had seen written on the mix CD's tracklist, before it went in another direction entirely. Joe wandered along the pavement, scuffing his heels against the slabs. He spotted Ben Radcliffe coming home from work and acknowledged him with a neighbourly nod, then returned to his thoughts. In their bedroom, Daisy and Ruby Herschey were still waiting for a word from their mother, who was yet to return. Daisy was lying upside down off the edge of the bed, kicking her legs, while Ruby paced back and forth. She walked over to the door, appeared to listen to it for a moment, then turned around to face her sister. "Do you think that mirror cost a lot?" Ruby asked. Daisy shrugged. Ruby began pacing again. She completed another lap of the room between their two beds, then returned to the door. She put her ear to it, and once again she listened. "It's so quiet. I think Mum's really angry." This time it wasn't a question, and so Daisy didn't feel the need to answer, not even with a shrug. The reason the rest of the house sounded so quiet was because it was empty, and had been since Lorraine had received a phone call from the couple that had walked in on her. They wanted to thank her, but they would be working with another agent to pursue some listings. Lorraine had taken a long walk around the neighbourhood, including a lingering moment of just standing on the pavement outside the old Hannibal house, staring at it, defeated. Suddenly, Violet's words on Lorraine's parenting skills flooded her mind. So when Violet opened the door to Lorraine, she was just as surprised as Lorraine herself had been earlier. Violet waited for Lorraine to speak first. "Can we talk?" she asked, doing everything in her power to maintain eye contact. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She stood aside and gestured for Lorraine to enter. When they moved through to the living room, Rob, who had been sitting watching television with Violet, stood to introduce himself cordially to Lorraine, then excused himself to the shed. "You have a lovely home," Lorraine said. "And Rob is your husband?" "Boyfriend, for now." "Have you ever struggled raising a girl on your own?" Violet didn't know how to begin answering. The question, as Lorraine had worded it, seemed to imply that struggling was a weakness. She knew the reality. "Well, yes, being a single parent has been hard at times," she explained. "I had Leona when I was quite young, and at that age I was so headstrong. But it turned out I didn't have much of a choice. Leona's dad didn't really want all that much to do with us." To her surprise, Lorraine wasn't acting like the lion Marigold had described. She was listening to Violet's every word. "What I mean is, it does take work, but it's possible." She paused. "Will you please excuse me for just a second?" Lorraine sat alone in the room, tapping uncomfortably on her knees. Violet returned a short time later with Leona in front of her, holding the little prince by her side. "This is my daughter, Leona. Leona, this is Lorraine Herschey." They considered each other as they exchanged pleasantries. Violet went on. "I couldn't be more proud of the remarkable young woman she has become." Leona, still unsure why she had been pulled away from her homework, shot a glance over her shoulder at her mother. "Mum, what are you—" "My suggestion is to spend a bit of time with your daughters. With Leona's permission, I'd like to lend you this book. Just try reading it together with them, and see what happens." The teenager blew a loose strand of hair away from her face and continued where her mother had left off. "Oh, they'll love it. It's all about how adults are wrong about most things because they have forgotten how to look at the world like a child does." Lorraine took the book that was being offered her and looked at the cover. She raised a cynical eyebrow. She imagined that going to her twins' room and suggesting to read them a bedtime story right now would be so unlike her, they would likely think it was some form of punishment. Instead, she looked up at Leona and thanked her. Once Leona had left, Lorraine stood up to leave too. She really ought to get back to her girls, she explained. But at the front door, Violet stopped her guest. "I understand wanting to do things your own way. It's your life. But when people offer to help, it's okay to say yes from time to time." Lorraine stood there for a second. On the short walk back to her house, she opened the top button of her work blouse and looked at the book's cover again in the fading evening light. She took a breath and felt a lightness in her shoulders she couldn't remember feeling in quite some time. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.